Well, joining me now is one of the legends of sports journalism who has successfully navigated print, television, digital. He's now at Northwestern University, the director of sports journalism there. It's Jay, a very familiar face if you're a sports fan, J.A. Adande. J.A., nice to see you, sir.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. Appreciate it.
So there's so many directions we could go. I'm like, that I want to get into, which is this weird, I don't know who's copying who. Is political talk show debate copying sports talk show debate, or sports talk show debate copying political? But actually, before we get into that, I want to start with this private equity story with the Big Ten and just sort of what this means and whether, look, you're a practitioner, you're not a part of the board of directors, you're not in these, in these conversations. But what does this mean? Where are we headed with college sports with this private equity? And is it actually something that is going to happen?
I think so. For example, the momentum seems to be there for the Big Ten to get this deal done. They're talking about a $2 billion infusion of cash led primarily, from what I've read, from the California teachers pension would be the primary investor.
Which is a fascinating, it was interesting. There's like, we're not private equity. It's not a hedge fund. It's a pension fund.
Yeah. which actually made a big difference to me when they said, hey, it's not a private equity hedge fund. CalPERS, which I think is the name of the fund, seems a little more legitimate or less ruthless, right? I, as a journalist or former journalist, kind of shiver when I hear hedge fund or private equity, because we've seen it ruin newspaper after newspaper, right? When they come in, and that's what they do. They strip things down to the bare bones, and then see what they can extract from the carcass. So my first instinct was to be very wary when I heard they were looking for private investment. But A, when I heard the source of the funds, but B, the fact that it would extend the current Big Ten arrangement for another 2 decades, from a selfish standpoint, I was glad to hear it, because as a Northwestern alumni and faculty member, I live in fear of the Big Ten and the SEC breaking off and away from the NCAA to form a super conference with the best of the best. Right. Because Northwestern would not be a part of that, when it comes to.
And it feels inevitable, like
the best of the best. I do think it's inevitable, Chuck, but I think this would delay it. And if this delays the inevitable, I'm actually in favor of it, because Northwestern would not be part of the new Super League.
Right. Now, watching USC and Michigan kill it, 2 of the teams that might be part of a Super League, tells you something. And certainly as an ACC guy myself, I've watched everybody sue each other over this grant of rights business and disputes over revenue sharing. But let me dovetail this into sports journalism. How much of the business of sports was a part of your beat in your head in the 90s versus how much of it now you have, how much more knowledge you have to be a day-to-day sports reporter on the sort of the business side of, if you don't understand the second apron, you don't understand free agency in the NBA, right? And well, I have to say, it's a real differentiator now in sports reporters, no?
Absolutely. But there's a difference between, the second apron in that talk is collective bargaining and salary cap. And that hasn't changed since when I first started. I remember when I first started covering the Chicago Bulls in 1994, I met with their salary cap expert who explained the salary cap to me. Now, that was many iterations of the salary cap ago, very different rules now. Yeah. But you did have to have an understanding of that, how things worked in the NBA. But now you do have to have an understanding of private equity and hedge funds and things like that, and how the markets move and react. So the greatest example was this past school year, I started teaching a class covering the business of sports. And it was far from my expertise. I had to bring in a lot of experts in the fields to talk about it. But we did start with the CBAs, the collective bargaining agreements, right? Because if you're going to cover a professional sport, you need to understand the collective bargaining agreement and what goes into negotiating that collective bargaining agreement, right? So I had represented a former representative of the NFL Players Union. I've had other lawyers come in. I've had a lawyer come in to explain the current name, image, likeness and college sports. We've had people talk about kind of the stadium game, right? And public funding for stadiums. That's something you need to
Mm-hmm.
understand, not just business, but the politics of stadium funding.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of the more fun things like collectibles or even sneakers, right?
Right.
And shoe contracts and the influences that shoe companies have, both in college and professional sports, right? So all these things that weren't necessarily a part, the CBA part, that hasn't changed. You need to know the
Right.
CBA. But aside from that, there's whole worlds from private equity all the way
Mm-hmm.
to the collectibles market.
One of the growth academic areas to that essentially students want to major in, and this has been I've noticed it in journalism. You're the director of sports journalism. There wouldn't have been a director of sports journalism at Northwestern 30 years ago, correct?
Absolutely not.
Right. This is the growth area of journalism schools. When I go to various journalism schools and we talk about, because sort of those getting into non-sports journalism are being told by their parents, this isn't a place to earn a living, right? There's not great jobs out there. But the one place where parents believe you can make a living is in sports journalism, even if it's not in. So what do you make of that, and how much is that transforming Medill?
Yeah, well, I joked when at the time I got this job, none of the things I was doing, including this job, existed when I was in school.
Right.
And that included appearing on ESPN on Around the Horn, that included doing podcasts, that included writing for ESPN.com, and my role as director of sports journalism. So it's a completely different landscape than I was in school for. One of the reasons this role was created was this has been, a great recruiting device, particularly for
To
the
response to
graduate.
demand?
Yeah, absolutely. Both the response to demand and an anticipation of, what would be appealing in this modern era to get people to want to go to a graduate journalism program. And, it's gone really well, including this year. We have, I think the number is 31 of about 120 of the graduate students are in the sports specialization program. And it's a very, this is the highest number we've had. So I won't say the journalism field has gotten better over the past decade. I think we can be honest and say this hasn't been the best decade for journalism and media.
No.
But this has actually increased. What I am saying, where I think the opportunities are in live sports production. So it doesn't necessarily mean that things are great for sports media overall. The fact that Sports Illustrated doesn't exist as we knew it, when you and I were growing up.
Right.
That's not great.
And that was been a destination, right? 20-year-old
Exactly.
Jay Adande. Man, I hope to be writing for Sports Illustrated. Like I would have said that about news.
That was a dream
I'd
of
have
mine.
said that about Newsweek as a political journalist in the early 90s. That would have felt like a destination. Boy, if you're writing for Newsweek now, you're hoping to get paid.
What's crazy though was even, as far back as 2007 when I took a bow from the LA Times and I got a call from Sports Illustrated. I won't say I got a job offer from Sports Illustrated, but I did, they did call and express some interest. And by that time, ESPN was a much better option because you could write, you could be on TV, radio, it was just a much better vertical than Sports Illustrated. And I remember thinking at the time, I can't believe I would ever have a call from Sports Illustrated and say thanks, but no thanks. And that's pretty much what happened then. So yeah, the destination, I think if you're a writer right now, The Athletic feels like the place where you'd want to be and you want to go. And it's funny because it's only been around, what, 10, 15 years at that?
Yeah.
Not even 15 years, I don't think.
Yeah, I was just going to say it feels about 10, yeah.
But, if you're going up, I mean, they've invested. And that's why I tell all my students, you better subscribe to The Athletic because if that goes away, that's it. So, if you have a dream, if you want to be a sports writer, you need to support this potential destination because if and when that goes, that's really the end of it for sports writing.
Is there, I mean, look, the downfall of sports writing is the same thing as the downfall of political journalism. We wiped out local, right? And yet the diversity of sports writing was because of local, right? What made Around the Horn in its first iteration awesome was you got the sports writers from these great sports sections, the Boston
And we
Globe.
literally used to come to you from the newsrooms,
Yes.
of our newspapers.
No, it's what gave it something extra, like it was right out of back when being called an ink stained wretch was a compliment, right? And look, I'm trying to revitalize local news. I think that when you look at our information ecosystem, the reason why, like, the core of trust is developed locally. And once that's gone, everything else disappears, right? If you don't have trust in local government, you're not going to have trust in national government. If you don't have any local media, you're not going to trust national media. I actually think sports is the way to rebuild local media. I think with the rise of interest in youth sports, gender diversity of youth sports, and the fact that it's a red America and blue America both want to see their kids succeed in youth sports. I see it as a place to just sort of rebuild community. And then from there, you could start to then add verticals into your local news environment that over time, as I say, if you're the place they go to watch their kids play, eventually they'll trust you when you tell them the city councilman's corrupt.
I think that's a noble option. The problem is there have been so many alternatives.
Noble, which is always code for, like, it may not work.
In part because, for example, I don't have kids, but my friends with kids, like, there's apps where, I've been with my friends when they're following, their son's Little League game.
Trust me, there's 5 apps. Just became an empty nester, so I just graduated from the youth
so you
sports
can finally delete the apps and free up some memory on your phones, right?
Correct. I mean, and that is part of, like, I actually think if you can, right now the youth sports is very siloed. And so I think the real opportunity is figuring out how to look at it instead of by sport, by community. But that is where I think the opportunity exists.
Well, I think, as recently, again, as 15 years ago, so I think you're right in terms of there was an opportunity to focus on local sports and build up from that. And that was the initial game plan for The Athletic, was that they were
and I hate that they're going away from that. That's that's the New York Timesification of The Athletic, right?
Exactly. But, again, I was happy to see the New York Times buy The Athletic because at least the New York Times is in the journalism business,
Mm-hmm.
And so there were, among the consequences was the dissolution of the New York Times own sports staff, right? So that wasn't good. But overall, I think it's healthy to have the New York Times owning The Athletic. But the reason The Athletic became of interest to the New York Times is the New York Times sees itself as a national outlet. Like, you could talk about the decline of the New York Times local coverage, right? Do they cover City Hall like other people do?
Nope.
Because it's all about scale.
Right.
And The Athletic went from really trying to own all, be a collection, a network of local markets, to instead being a national sports news outlet. And so that's changed. So, I think the problem is, the type of local coverage that you're proposing, I'm not sure anyone with deep enough pockets would be interested in that, because it doesn't scale.
There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win.
It's interesting. How would you describe the local sports ecosystem now for information? Is it driven primarily by podcasters? Is it driven by local ex-sports radio guys who've sort of done their own YouTubes? Is it blog? Yeah, I know in college sports, I just want to follow the University of Miami. The Miami Herald still does a pretty good job of it. They know that, frankly, the only reason I pay for the Miami Herald is for their University of Miami football coverage. So, and you can tell with their sports, they still have a semi-vibrant, used to be a great sports page. I think it's like the Washington Post. They still want to, there's still a remnant of what it used to be, and they want to keep that. They don't want to lose it. Yeah. But I get just as much from these I don't know what to describe them, on three rivals, that world. How would you describe the local, if you're a White Sox fan, where do you get your information?
Well, the problem is it used to be that's where you would go to find out what's going on with the team, right? That they're going to re-sign this player, or this player is going to get traded, if the manager is going to get fired. But that's been nationalized and upscaled too. So if you think about the major sports, right, the breaking stories, the trades, the injuries, everything, in the NBA, it's going to come from Shams Charania, like Adrian Wojnarowski, who kind of held that corner before him.
So the Houston beat reporter is going to get scooped by Shams when it comes to Kevin Durant news, right?
Yeah,
it's just
exactly. Or an Adam Schefter covering the NFL, et cetera. Jeff Passan does a great job in Major League Baseball. Ken Rosenthal, those guys. So the problem is it's so much more efficient for the teams to leak
just
something
talk to one entity
to those people, and you get it out everywhere, right? Rather than, if you leak it out to your local news outlet, but it'll get picked up, but not as fast.
But here's the weird flaw in this. If your team stinks for a period of time, like I say this, I grew up, all my mom's family are White Sox fans. They're Southsiders, ex-Southsiders, right? So, right. It's been a tough, it's been a tough century, right? To be a White Sox fan. They got the one bright light in 05. But if you're a bad team, the national reporters don't cover you.
Right.
Right. So then there's this black hole. Frankly, if you're a have-not team, right? Cincinnati Reds, Chicago White Sox, Colorado Rockies, where do you get your info if your local news environment is just not very, supportive of a sports section?
We've seen some things pop up, like I think it's starting in Denver, the DNVR, and here in the Chicago version, I think it's CHGO. So local websites and podcasts that are focused on the team.
Totally local sports or what?
Yeah, they're just focused on that city sports. But what you don't get is necessarily that breaking news, right? Because they're not necessarily at the ballpark covering the teams. They're they're not in the arena. They're not cultivating the sources. So you can get plenty of discussion about the teams. And if if you want to have a debate about who should, what the rotation should look like, right? Or who should be the closer? Should they bring this guy up from AAA? You can get that discussion and debate, and there's forums for that, and you can listen in and you can participate. But where's the news going to come from? And Chuck, what's the responsibility of journalists and holding people accountable? Right. So who can hold people to account? Who can put pressure on teams? Why have the White Sox been allowed to be this bad for this long? Right. In part because they're not like
there's no local media putting pressure.
Sometimes they don't always have beat writers. Like the Tribune doesn't cover the White Sox full time as a beat. Right. So when that happens, when you don't have a watchdog assigned, that's how you get this type of thing. And then you don't hear the White Sox pop up once again, when they're looking to fund the stadium, right?
Right. Well, that gets to something that I think is very challenging in the journalism field. And I'll give you an expression that is frowned upon in the political world, but I would argue is a necessity in the sports world. And that is, quote unquote, access journalism. I think if you're a beat writer, you have to have access to the ballpark. You have to have access to the team headquarters. And these are private enterprises. They can choose to say, J.A., you're a jerk. I don't like you. You're out. I'm not credentialing you. And you're like, there's no Freedom of Information Act, right? To sort of, like I've always said, the Pentagon reporters got kicked out. There's going to be ways to force the publication of certain information, and it's not ideal. And I think you can do 75% of reporting on politics remotely. The difference maker is that 25%, it being there matters. I believe that with sports too. But it's a fine line on access journalism. You talk about accountability. If Dan Schneider kicked the Washington Post out of the team facilities, wouldn't let him in, and then therefore over time, Washington fans stopped going to the Post for information because they didn't have it. How do you view that line? You're now you're teaching these young journalists. Where's your head on this? Because I think it's an extra challenge that sports journalists have that frankly we political journalists don't.
And it's gotten tougher in part because it used to be they would absorb, the team would have to absorb whatever you said about them, good or bad, because they needed you, right? If you were a fan, something as basic as what time is the game tonight and, what TV station is it on?
Right.
You would have to go to the newspaper to get that basic information, right? The newspapers were vital. If you were a team getting any type of information out about your franchise, you needed the newspaper, right? And so you couldn't afford to shut them out. Now you can't afford to shut them out, right? You can have your own stories on your website and through your social media feeds. So you don't need the newspapers or the local media to tell the stories and to get the word out about your team. So we have seen a good example was Deion Sanders at Colorado, basically banning a columnist that he didn't like, right? For the opinions that columnist had. So it has become a lot easier because you don't need them. You used to have to absorb whatever people had to say about you because you needed them to say something about you. And now that they don't, we've seen it's still there's still kind of some legacy where, the leagues will try to enforce some rules. You have to have certain access. There's
the NFL seems pretty good about it, right? Yeah.
Baseball Writers Association, the Pro Basketball Writers, NFL, right? So you've got advocate groups that will try to fight to protect access for people. But also just because they can credential you, now it doesn't mean you're going to see players in the locker room or the clubhouse, right? It started in the 90s and the 2000s. The stadiums were designed. There's so many behind the scenes places that, no matter how long the locker room is open before the game, you might never see a guy because he's back in the trainer's room, which is off limits, or they've got a player's lounge that's off limits. So even with the access, that doesn't mean you can talk to them. One thing I am glad about is that I thought the pandemic was going to be an opportunity for these leagues to really
kill it.
The media. Because for safety protocols, no one was allowed in the locker room or on the field before the game. And to the league's credit, they basically restored the pre-pandemic access once the pandemic was over.
I tell you, in the world of political, my fear at the time was I'm never going to get an on-set guest ever again. The minute everybody figured out, and that has been harder for all of the Sunday shows. You can still get it, but you've got to compromise all sorts of principles. You got to pre-tape it, or you got to do it on their schedule, or, you don't have any of the sort of, well, look, this is when we tape. If you want to be on, you got to come now, right? Which maybe in the 80s or 90s, you could have done a flex like that. You don't get the flex like that anymore.
So one difference, a huge difference between political coverage and sports coverage is that in sports, we just have these hard to find, undeniable truths. This team won, this team lost. The quarterback threw 3 touchdowns, or he threw 3 interceptions, or
here's the data,
so,
to back up your
that's
what happened.
One thing where there's been this divergence. You talked earlier about the similarities, but one of the main divergences is sports is one of the last place where we're not debating the actual facts. We can have debate about whether it's good or bad. We can debate whether Shohei Ohtani put on the greatest postseason performance in playoff history. We can debate that, right? But we're not debating the fact that he pitched 6 shutout innings and hit 3 home runs and struck out 10, and the Dodgers won, right? So in politics, who's responsible for the government shutdown, right? Or if and when it ends,
more subjective. Yeah.
Which side won, right? We're going to have a debate. Oh, who this side won or this side won, right? The beauty of sports is that it's clear cut and defined, and we have winners and losers, and the outcome is not subject to debate.
Well, that's a nice transition to the state of sports talk, right? Which is, look, as a fan, I love it in some ways, but it has gotten to the point of where it feels formulaic and like the WWE, right? Meaning, I don't know if the takes are real or if the takes are designed to get traffic. And look, I feel that way about cable television politics, right? Now, the one thing ESPN, Fox Sports 1, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News all have in common is that they have shrinking platforms, right? So they're fighting over a shrinking base of potential viewers. But how do you assess the evolution of sports talk and what it was? Sports reporters, right? Some people might say the old beat the press, right? For sports, which is the way I always viewed it. In fact, as a consumer, I used to watch Beat the Press. Sports Reporters was right after. Then I watched 11:30 This Week. I used to literally watch all three as my Sunday routine. And what we have today with Stephen A. or Pat McAfee or my friend Colin Cowherd. Like, I don't want to single, because I know everybody says, well, it's Stephen A. It's there's 4 or 5 guys that are in this space. What do you think? What do you make of the evolution of it?
So I agree that the early models, the sports reporters, for example, was more based on the political debate shows like a Crossfire or something like that, right? But keep in mind that, the modern version, the 21st century version that's kind of led the way for everything, which was Pardon the Interruption, the template for that was Siskel and Ebert, right? 2 movie critics who would debate and argue and it's funny because they were debating.
Boy, when now I want to think of Tony and Mike as Siskel and Ebert. 100%. I might throw that at Tony when I do my picks.
That was the model, Mark Shapiro, who basically came up with the concept for it. He was running ESPN at the time, and he wanted a sports version of Siskel and Ebert. So yeah, they will take that as a compliment, obviously. And then the producer, Eric Rideholm of the show, came from Chicago, so he was influenced both by Siskel and Ebert, who were 2 Chicago-based movie critics, and also the original the sports writers on TV, which was the first one of those, which was, Chuck, again, we talk local to national. That was a local thing, but they did talk about a lot of national issues, but it was based here in Chicago.
Right.
And
Wilmot and Kornheiser got their start on local Channel 4 here in DC.
Yeah, in Washington. Yeah. So, the other thing is there that kind of path from local to national, and it's going to be harder and harder to find, I think, people getting a start locally and then going up to the bigger stage. But so you went from a political model to this kind of movie model, which was more contentious. Siskel and Ebert were a lot more contentious. But the interesting thing was that, it wasn't a winnable argument, right? You like the movie, I don't like the movie. Neither one of us is, objectively right? It's a matter of taste. Right. Around the Horn, which was descended from Pardon the Interruption, but it was based on the premise that you could win an argument, which was patently absurd, right? The whole premise around the Horn, that there's points and that you can score more points than someone else on this argument, is absurd because there is no winning the argument of who's the greatest player, right? There is no right answer. Right. So it was all a joke in a way, right? That
that's what I appreciate about Around the Horn, is that I felt like everybody's kind of in on the joke.
Yeah. Well, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. What was funny to me was, I didn't really care if I won or I lost. I got paid the same either way. In fact, it used to be you could get eliminated with 2 rounds to go. Now you could get eliminated with 1 round to go, but you get paid the same. So in some ways, you're better off losing early because you're getting more money for less work, or you're getting the same money.
Same money for less work. Yeah.
But it didn't bother me. I could very easily lose and then be out the door and be on my way for the rest of the day. Sometimes I request to be eliminated early because I might have a flight or I had to go cover practice or something. So I said, get me out of here early.
Or I don't have a good rant. Like, right. The reward was, I got something to shill, right? Like, I don't have anything to say this week. Don't make me win.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Eliminate me. But what I found was that people would come up and the people were invested in whether or not you win.
No
The people
kidding.
who watch the show.
Are these the
And
people that think
so
wrestling is real?
I think so. Wrestling, most wrestling outdoes most sporting events, right? So there's a huge audience for that fake competition. I mean, Around the Horn was fake competition.
Right.
That's no secret, no trade secret I'm getting out there. Sometimes it would be predetermined. Very often it wasn't, right? It could be at the whims of the host. But there was some times where maybe somebody had a guest that they wanted to bring in at the end, or it was their 1000th episode. So it'd be nice to give them a victory on that episode or something like that, right? So sometimes it was predetermined. So yes, if you bet on it,
Hey, that was it.
But people cared so much, so it made me start to care who won or lost.
That's interesting.
People get invested whether or not it's actual real competition.
Well, I want to finish this. So we don't have it anymore. What does that say? That we're going more to the singular influencer model? Because that was a collective influencer model, right? This is now, it's McAfee and he has a cast of characters, or it's Stephen A. He's got his cast, even to a much lesser extent, I'd say Greenberg, or that. But I guess we have a new iteration. How would you describe it?
So it's not that, the paying all the people, all the panelists was the problem, right? Because you could add up what we all made and it wasn't what Stephen A made. It was the fact that from the corporate side, they're looking at the cost of production. So the thing about a McAfee or a Stephen A is those guys can eat up a couple hours each, right? With good viewership with the same production. Whereas, it was inefficient to have Around the Horn for a half hour, PTI for a half hour, even though it was under the same production umbrella, you still had two different groups of producers, right? The studio time, satellite time, all those things. So the reason why that model is winning the cow herd is that if you can have one person that can eat up 2 hours with one production group, that's what they're gonna go for. And the ultimate reason people say, well, why did Around the Horn go away? We're gonna see the end of the studio show, because I agree. As these, the ESPNs and the Foxes go from TV stations where you have to fill up 24 hours to streaming where it's on demand. The only reason Around the Horn and PTI existed in the first place was because you needed something on the air before the game started. During the day when there's no games, you need something to fill that up. Right. So now they're just going to look for the things, can we go from Stephen A to McAfee, and there's 4 hours with two people and two production groups. And so, they'll stay with
that. And they don't have to own the show, right? They're going to license. I think this is where, it's funny. At first, you could argue sports talk was copying politics. Now I kind of think political news is going to copy sports. And you're going to see, I fully expect the new version of MSNBC, they're going to call it MS Now, their next couple of hosts,
CNN
maybe
streaming site.
Right. They may license, they may say, hey, I mean, look, I'm part of a group right now for something called Newsphere, where everybody owns their own content, but everybody's going to share the revenue of the subscription. So you may license a show so that, hey, your linear television exclusive home for Pat McAfee, but he's going to have his, own his own studio over here, and he's going to own his production over here, and he's going to sell this and monetize that. And in some ways, the legacy media companies, hey, that's 10 less people they're paying healthcare for.
Exactly. And then we're going to start to see the rebundling, right? Who is it? There's two streamers that just announced that they were going to partner.
Netflix and Spotify, right?
Yeah.
Right. Where Spotify's licensing content to Netflix. And what is this really about? Not allowing those shows to show up on YouTube. So suddenly Netflix,
so they're all trying to surround YouTube.
Well, what's interesting is who's the king of the hill right now, right? It's essentially Netflix and YouTube, and they're the two giants.
Right.
Everybody else is much less, right? If you want to pitch a new TV show, Netflix is where you want to be first. That's number one. Yeah. When you get rejected there, then you start to move down to everybody else. And go ahead.
And Netflix is not looking for the debate shows like we've seen.
No, although I'm curious. They're licensing these ringer shows, which are what I would say are light debate shows. Like Simmons isn't a hot take guy, but there's
Right.
certainly takes on it, and has point of view. But you're right. I don't think it's a debate.
Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting is that, these successful podcasts are like local in that it's an intimate relationship, right? I mean, the whole thing with local was that it just felt community-based, and these successful podcasts have built these large communities, but podcasting is such an intimate medium. So in some ways it replaces that intimacy of local, but at a much bigger scale, and a national scale.
J.A., I talk about this all the time. The biggest difference for me doing a podcast versus doing Meet the Press is I'm much less of a jerk. Because, look, part of it is you had a finite amount of time, and there was sort of like, I always say, look, Meet the Press, 60 Minutes, certain brands are above the individual, and you're there, and there's an expectation of accountability. In a podcast, your audience is choosing to hear you. And it is a personal relationship. I mean, I don't know about you. There are times where you hear this and you're like, hey, I'll tell my wife something I heard on a podcast, and it's like, I was talking to somebody. No, I wasn't. I was listening. I was eavesdropping on somebody else's conversation. But it feels that intimate. And what it means is, I always say this to guests that are always like, oh, which Chuck Todd am I going to get? And I said, look, we're not, I'm going to ask you tough questions, but I'm going to word them friendlier, because the audience won't bother they don't want to be made to be uncomfortable. Like it's a real interesting balance you've got to have in this intimate relationship that you have with your viewers or listeners.
And I mean, it was similar when, we started, newspapers, and then the blogs started showing up. Blogs are a lot more personal. If I was writing for the LA Times, there's a certain formality that comes with it, and it's not about me. But if you come to my blog, then it is much more about me, and I had a blog at the LA Times. So
you might share your dog, or your, hey, we got a new cat in the house, no dog in the house, or something like that, right? Yeah.
It was two different voices that I had when I was writing for the newspaper and writing for the blog that was on the newspaper site even.
The last sort of topic I want to get to is the infusion and the professionalization of gambling, right? And what has this meant for sports journalism? And because there's a certain amount of journalism that goes into these analytics sites that are about gambling. There's certainly, you have generational discomfort with how much gambling, like I've got older relatives who are like, why does everything have to be about the point spread now during a pregame show? And then there are other people that are like, why do they waste their time on all these soft shows? Just give me some data that I need to decide what game I'm going to bet on. Where does this fit in your journalism program?
So we've talked about, that's one of the things, we had a segment on in my business to sports class, right? You have to talk about gambling, and I make it very clear that that's the smartest audience. Like, you have to be the most precise when you're addressing that audience, because for the most part, you might know more than the audience. Generally, you do. But with gambling, they're so, this is their money at stake. So they're hyper invested. So they might know more than you. And you have to know all the terminology, right? So either you have to go all in, you can't just touch it lightheartedly, right? You're of no use at that point. So it's really important. What I like about it is it's creating more opportunities. Again, we talk about things that didn't exist.
This has opened up the market for sports journalists.
In some ways. Initially, they were more interested in content and editorial content, less so now. But I do think there's still a niche, and probably a lucrative niche, right, to speak to that audience, because the audience is huge. So the importance of knowing the lingo, right, knowing all the jargon that goes with it, being able to speak that language, and then it just places a premium on being accurate more than ever, right? You always want to be accurate, but now again, if somebody makes a bet based on a report that you had that turned out to be inaccurate, they might find you in this day and age. So the importance of accuracy, but it's also elevated. One of the reasons Adam Schefter has millions of followers is because, timing is everything, right? Like, can you get something in before the word becomes widespread and the line shifts, right? If you find out that a key player is injured and you can get your bet in before the line changes, well, that's very valuable, right? So time is money more than ever. So the shift to, you know, accuracy and speed, but with speed comes risk.
Right.
That's probably the problem too. So, because
what
you
about
know
the
it's better,
morality piece? What about the morality piece?
It was always kind of like newspapers wanted to have it both ways. They would discourage gambling, but they would print the lines in the back. You know, the lines were growing up in the LA Times, and I don't know what I
Correct
was
me if
supposed
I'm
to do
wrong.
with them,
I think
but
the New
lines
York
were all
Times
available.
I think the New York Times was one of those entities that never put the lines in the paper.
But most did. So there was always this acknowledgement that gambling existed. It's funny because the leagues didn't want the newspapers printing the lines. The leagues didn't want any type of discussion. You know, going back, we talked about this in my class. The reason Jimmy the Greek would pick the scores was that was his way of saying whether or not the team was going to cover. Like, it wasn't about, you know, he thought this final score was going to be this, but he did think
that was
this
the
team was
negotiation they made with the NFL to say, all right, we'll have our gambling expert just predict final scores.
Yeah.
And those who know will know. If you know, you know.
Exactly.
As the kids say today, right?
So now you can be overt about it, right? And now you just, everyone's got their picks, and then in between the commercials come, and here you see the same talent that you just saw, you know, at the desk, you know, touting these betting apps and websites, right? So, you know, the walls have come down completely. I don't question the morality of it. That doesn't bother me that much. You know, are you serving the audience, right? That's the most important thing as a media. Are you serving the audience?
This is the issue. I say that the missing mindset of journalism schools in general is service journalism, meaning there's accountability journalism, but there's basic service journalism, and what you think is just informational, another person is it's an actionable item. Telling somebody where there's cheaper chicken is service journalism. Right. Even though that's not going to win you a Pulitzer. And you're right. In some ways, you know, there's gamblers out there and they're looking for content. You serve it. So do you think this needs to be can you imagine your sports journalism programming teaching a sort of sports betting 101 class?
Yeah, and I would probably do more of it if I was more familiar with that, if I had more of a gambling background. But I have guest lecturers in to talk about gambling. We have opportunities, for example, for our students to intern at gambling-based websites, right, or news outlets.
That's not going to be an entity that you would not allow to have interns from the journalism program. Yeah.
No, I mean, the only reason there isn't more of it is just because that's not my interest and my background, right? Yeah. But it's not a moral opposition to it. And I do encourage our students to learn more about it and to pursue it if that's where they're interested, you know, and you know, we've had a few students who have graduated and gone into gambling. You know, I always I'll hear from someone with the gambling site or a show and say, hey, do you have anyone? And so I'll kind of send out the word, hey, who among you likes to gamble, is interested in gambling, you know, but it's not, you shouldn't do it if you don't really know it. You know, more than that, you can kind of fake a lot of things in the journalism business. You cannot fake it if you're talking about gambling.
No, gamblers will know if you're faking it. Yeah. No, they'll know. Are you seeing just a more gender diversity in the sports program?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. The gender diversity has been great. It's funny. One of my first classes that I taught here, sports commentary class, I looked up a couple weeks before school started, and there's no women in the class, you know, and I had to put out an APB and try to round up, and we were able to get one, a freshman. I felt sorry for her. She was the lone female in the class. But then, you know, out of a class of 18, it'd be 2 or 3, 4 or 5. And now we're up to almost 50%, you know, I would say, in the sports commentary classes, you know, and it's really important to have women giving opinion, right? You know, because that's kind of the prime space. You talked about the Pat McAfee, the Stephen A's, you know, we don't have a female, a real equality would be we have a female version of that, right? People showing up and a woman making a lot of money to give her opinions and hosting her own show, not being the moderator for 2 men on the panel, but, you know, being the prime opinion giver.
Or so not being the sideline. And we're still with the sideline reporter is almost always female.
Right. And in the booth. It's funny. We had a section. I was very proud. A couple years ago, there were 5 women in the booth in the NBA, either play-by-play or analyst. And 2 of them were Medill graduates. Lisa Byington with the Bucks and Katie Winge with the Denver Nuggets. So it took a while, but I was able to get them both here on campus to celebrate the fact that 40% of the women broadcasting the NBA at one local teams were Medill graduates. 40% sounds better than 2, but so it's growing. There's opportunities. I say, there's never been a better time to be a woman in the sports media field. And it's not completely balanced yet, but we're seeing, what's cool to me is like, I'll turn on a game and maybe I hear like Candace Parker doing the commentary when she was with Turner, and it doesn't seem unusual. Right. I think it's starting to be normalized hearing female voices.
Well, Doris Burke has been, I think, helped. She helped blaze a lot of trails here, and I know. The problem is when you blaze a trail, then when you're not in that position, it becomes a bigger deal. I hate how much attention her so-called demotion got. But in some ways, that's how you know you've made it, right? When the demotion gets as much attention as, in some ways, more attention.
And also, she got there in the first place. I mean, the news is that she's no longer on the A team, but the real core of the story, the nut graph, is that she was on the A team, right? And she called NBA Finals for ESPN and ABC.
So let me just get you out of here on how much do you think now, the politics of everything is what I call it, right? We have a way sometimes of politicizing everything. The sports world has this debate all the time, which is, I want to get out of social commentary in my sports. Sports is my distraction. And at the same time, these are cultural icons. So they have just as much to say about the culture that they're helping to create, expand, revitalize, whatever you want to describe, as anybody else in any other field. And yet it feels like the big sports broadcasters don't want any of that anymore. So where are we on that, in that space? Because I look at sports and, sports has done a lot for civil rights in this country, not just for African-American civil rights, but we just talked about for women opportunities. Like in some ways, it has been a place to break barriers without as much controversy as you had it in other spaces. And yet there's this constant debate. Hey, let's not talk about this stuff in our sports commentary. Where are we today on this? I felt like 10 years ago, everybody was like, no, it's all infused. It's all part of the stew. And now it feels like nobody wants to touch it again.
Yeah, 2 things. One, it feels like there's been a retreat. Like there's nothing physically blocking anyone from speaking out, but some of the prominent voices that we've had in the recent years have had less to say. There has been some, because there's been some gender equity. We'll see the new collective bargaining agreement for the WNBA will kind of let us know where we stand. But equal pay for the female soccer players, right, from USA Soccer. So we've seen some breakthroughs. So even though we're not there, maybe the arguments don't have to be as loud. The flip side is that we've seen sports, after leading the way in civil rights and so long, we've seen sports as the entry point for discrimination, particularly with the trans issue, right? And so using the premise of sports, to ban trans people from activities, to discriminate on the basis of sexual identity, whereas sports one time led the way to equality. Now we're seeing people specifically being banned based on their identity, right? So sports became a weapon, because can you ban trans people from the workplace? No, but it's a lot easier. And the interesting thing is, even people like Martina Navratilova, who was obviously a big advocate for gay equality, lesbian equality. She was on the side of, trans.
This has really divided the women's sports world, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you do. I noticed. I follow Martina. I find her comment. She's fascinating. I think she's got. I'm always curious what she's thinking, and she's pretty. she takes a lot of arrows for this one, right? She's a pretty progressive lefty on like 90% of issues, not on this one.
Not on this one.
Yeah.
So here we've seen sports divide. The fact that we still haven't had, really, we had Michael Sam enter the NFL's draft, but, we haven't really seen openly gay NFL players.
Yeah. When we have a star, when a Super Bowl MVP is openly gay.
Right.
That's when so that barrier is gone. Right. Yeah.
So sports is lagging in the LGBTQ issues, and is even an entry point for discrimination on those issues. So that's kind of where we are. We Jackie Robinson and all this legacy of integration and equality through sports, and sports leading the way. Now it's gone in a different direction, and sports has certainly lagged behind. You could argue that the biggest issue right now, the other thing is, Latino issues. It's black and white for so long. Right now, Latino equality and discrimination
a little bit,
is the primary thing. And we would think baseball, should be leading the way with such a heavily Latino presence and, so many superstars like, Vlad Guerrero. And you could argue the kind of diminishment of the media too, right? And I know Vlad Guerrero Jr. plays in Canada, but, every road game he plays is in the United States. And, you might wonder, okay, what does he have to say about this, right? And it feels like he doesn't get asked. And this might not be the time to ask him, as he's, on the verge of the World Series and the baseball playoffs as we record this. But still, why are none of the prominent Latino baseball players speaking out?
I remember wasn't it Carlos Delgado who sort of I think he spoke out at a time. It was sort of end of his career, and it may have cost him a free agency signing.
Yeah. And maybe the reason that there's kind of this history, like there's this school of thought that the reason that you're seeing so many Latino stars in baseball and fewer African-American stars in baseball is because the control factor, right? You can recruit them in the Caribbean and bring them over and sign them for less money, right? And there's just kind of more control.
There's no child labor law. I mean, apparently you could sign 14 and 15 and have some sort of unofficial financial control over them in the Dominican or in Venezuela.
And there were ways, that you could maybe bypass the draft, right? And get those. So there's a lot there, and it hasn't been explored enough. The Washington Post did a great Latino baseball project, but outside of that, we're not talking about this enough. And this is the issue of the day. I think that the hour, Chuck, is Latin American, and how are we going to integrate and/or assimilate, or are we just trying to get rid of them all, right? And so
that's a great way of framing it. I sort of look at it as this is the last gasp of a sort of aging. Patriarchy probably is probably the way to put it, or some sort of aging establishment.
I'd like to think of that way, and a lot of times I thought of.
Well, I grew up in Miami, and I went through this in the 70s and 80s, where Miami was a southern city. I always say I was born in Miami, and I graduated high school in Miami. And Miami's a thriving international destination.
Right.
Man. It banned English. It banned Spanish language from government material in 1980. JA, okay, that isn't like the 1880s. It was 1980.
In Miami, not Florida.
It was Miami. This was Dade County had a referendum.
Wow.
So, and it was sort of right after the Marielito boat lift, and there was just a lot of. It was the conversation America's having today. This is why Miami is always city of the future, because in some ways, been there. We already had the debate, right? And we're going to be better on the other side, but I'm not going to lie. We also had to have 3 race riots that were tri-racial riots, tri-ethnic riots. It wasn't clean black versus white. It was Cubans and blacks and whites, and it was very uncomfortable in the 80s. But what came out of it was this thriving sort of post, as I say, like Miami became Singapore, right? It's sort of this incredible international destination. But I liked how you framed that, because you're right. I do think the rest of the country is going through this identity crisis, right? What does America look like for the next 100 years versus what it looked like the last 100 years? Yeah. And you're right. We don't touch that story in sports.
And I thought the trans issue was that for some people, there's almost a pathological need to discriminate. And it became out of favor to discriminate against blacks, and it became, legislated against that you couldn't, and Latino, like for a while, and then as gays even won, for example, legalized marriage and won other rights in that way, kind of the last segment that you could gang up on without that much pushback or protection was trans people. Right. So I thought the reason that this became an issue was because this was kind of the last, quote unquote, acceptable discrimination that we could have. Right. Where there would not be as much pushback. And, my fear is, and I think we're seeing coming to light, though, is you start there and then it starts to spread. Right. So if you don't protect their rights, OK, then we'll move on to another group.
Well, that famous poem about the Nazis. First they came for the Catholics, and first they came, and then they came for me. Right.
Yeah. And we started focusing on trans, and no, you can't participate. We're going to ban you. We're going to discriminate against you. And now there's it's illegal to be Latino in this country. That's the next step, is we're kind of declaring, an illegitimacy and an illegality to people based on their
something that's arguably been
the fabric. Muslim ban, right?
Right. The fabric of our country has always been, we assimilate outsiders. Yeah. Right. And we've always been this weird contradiction, right? We're that's the origin story of our country. And the minute we get here, everybody wants to keep everybody else out. It's the strangest. I made it, but not you,
right.
But that's
so it's interesting time. And Chuck, I fear that sports will not be at the forefront, because we've seen the last couple hot issues.
Even though sports used to be arguably the place was at the front. I mean, look, I had a great interaction one time with Willie Mays. Willie Obama brought him on Air Force One to go to the All-Star game, his first year in office. So they bring Willie back to the press plane. And I said, so I happened to be back there. I didn't happen to be back there. I found out we were going to the All-Star game, and it was NBC's turn. I'm like, I'm going. I'm taking this seat, right? I pulled Reich on that one. But I remember asking him, what's it like, here you are in Air Force One. Did you ever, with the first African-American president? And he said, it meant everything I went through was worth it. That's all he said. He didn't elaborate on it. But I always said, being black in the 1950s in baseball, you think that was easy?
Yeah.
It's probably the hardest thing. We've created there's a movie about Jackie's experience. But Willie and Hank Aaron and
Larry Doby, right?
Larry Doby, Don Newcomb, probably was driven to alcoholism by it. We don't know that, but I think that, but for that, he might be the greatest pitcher of his generation. It was hard, beyond hard. And that's where baseball, we had to break a barrier in baseball before we guaranteed voting rights, right?
Yeah. Jackie Robinson's before Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King at least had Jackie's footsteps to walk in. Right. Who did Jackie get to follow?
You don't think the sports world in the next 25 years is going to be leading the space of equal rights going forward for various?
I don't. And one reason is, you talked about the politics of everything.
Yeah.
And I think sports has become a sanctuary. Not that it should be or needs to be, but I find myself seeking solace in sports and an escape in a bubble. And I was someone, my writings, I always tried to incorporate and put sports in the context of society and deal with society issues through the prism of sports. And now I am someone, as a consumer, who wants my sports to be in a bubble, just because it's everywhere else, right?
I am a walking contradiction myself. My favorite sports books are the ones that are grounded in American culture and about, there's this history of the Negro Leagues and about, Jewish financiers who worked with, because nobody else would take their money. And so they, there were all these incredible stories that are larger than about sports. And you're right, nobody wants those stories told right now through the prism of sports. They'd go do it as a documentary for politics, but get it out of ESPN, right? J.A., this was great, man. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, man. This is awesome. Good talking to you.